Go ahead and get started. Thank you all for joining us today for the latest installment of our CORES talks. In the last two talks, we're going to be focusing on the sharing of research objects. And so we're really lucky to have John Borghi here today. John is a manager of research and instruction at the Lane Medical Library in the Stanford School of Medicine. And he's a CORES affiliate and actually a member of our executive committee. So we've been really happy to have him involved in CORES sort of from the beginning. He has a background in neuroscience, but it's for the last number of years has been really focused on helping researchers do research that is more open and reproducible, kind of exactly along the lines of what CORES hopes to bring to the entire campus. John, go ahead and take it away.
Thanks for that introduction. Let me just bring up my slides. All right, so as Russ said, my perspective is maybe a little bit different than some of the previous speakers, where I still do some research here and there. I was actually just right before logging in doing some research related work, but a lot of my day-to-day these days is about supporting and collaborating with researchers as they do their research and more specifically look to make it available to others. So I will be talking about how to share research objects. I'll be talking mostly conceptually about kind of what that means, what that looks like. And then the next talk, my colleagues from Stanford libraries will be talking about sort of how to actually do it in practice. Okay. So in the spirit of sharing research objects, I have made the slides available in a digital repository prior to the talk. So there's some links in the slides. In case some of the GIFs I have don't work, you can go and download the PDF and the PowerPoint version of these slides here. And Franklin was nice enough to put it in the chat, so you can follow along that way. Okay, so let's talk. I think it behooves us to talk about kind of what a research object actually is. And to do that, I will draw upon my own kind of background and use an experiment, a very typical experiment in sort of cognitive psychology, cognitive neuroscience, where I did my academic training. You have a participant who's sat in front of a computer reacting to something, right? So let's consider that experiment. We have a person who comes into the lab and does something. So we have one research object already, which is our protocol, our list of things to have them do, and for us as research assistants or researchers to make them do or have them do while they're there. Another set of research objects might be the surveys and questionnaires that we created as part of our study, or we are reusing from someone else's study that we have them do while they're sitting down. We probably have created some task for them to do. So we have some software to present things to the participants and record their responses. We also have stimuli, potentially, images or audio or video or some sort of presentation. We're presenting something to the participants that they are reacting to. We might have made these ourselves, or we might be, again, drawing upon the work of others. Then we have some data, right? We have their responses. We have the responses of individuals, and as we kind of proceed in the course of our work, we have data that is collected and combined between participants and within participants. And then we also have software that we need to use to process, analyze, and visualize that data, right? To create whatever statistical analyses we might be doing, whatever sort of data cleaning procedures we might be doing, whatever kind of amazing figures we might be drawing from our very basic looking experiment. We have some software tools to do that. And then we have notes, probably. When I was doing research in sort of a cognitive neuroscience field, one of the major notes that I wrote down was like a participant fell asleep in the MRI, but you might have whatever kind of work you're doing, you might have different kinds of notes. And then, of course, we want to report on what we've done. So there might be a paper or a preprint or some other kind of thing that we create sort of towards the tail end of the experiment, or at least the end of a certain phase of the experiment. And so we have this very basic looking experiment or setup, right, where we have a person sitting in front of a computer, pressing a button, maybe to just dots on a screen, right? And we've already come up with a pretty substantial number of research objects. So I'm going to go ahead and kind of define what that is. So a research object is any kind of material that is created or used as part of a research effort. In my sort of day-to-day life, the ones that I talk about the most are data sets and research papers, primarily those two things, software also increasingly, but there's any number of other things that we could be talking about, protocols, documentation, images, all kinds of different things. And when we're talking about sharing research objects, by sharing, I mean kind of simply the release of materials for use by others. So I will be talking primarily about sharing in kind of the sense of open science, sharing broadly with other researchers, kind of at the conclusion of a research effort. There are forms of sharing that can happen throughout the course of a research project. You can share data with collaborators as you're working on it. I'm not going to talk about that so much. I'll be talking mostly about sort of open public data sharing at the conclusion of a project and similar things like that. But something else that I do want to emphasize is that I'll be talking a lot about research process. And by that, I just mean this series of steps or kind of ways of doing things that are followed as part of a research effort. This is like a maybe not so amazing graphic design wise illustration here of, there's a path between your research question and your research results. And along that path, you make a number of different decisions, and those decisions may or may not affect the result, but they can certainly affect kind of your products. And when I talk about process, mostly what I'm talking about is this sort of path in blue, if you're looking at the slides right now, like how you got from point A to point B. And yeah, just to reiterate, sharing with individual researchers, not exactly the same thing as sharing more broadly. And we'll talk about that when we talk about some specific things. Okay, so like I said, a research object might include research reports, articles, preprints, even more kind of preliminary reports if you have those, posters, that kind of thing. Can include data sets, can include process related stuff, which is my really technical way of referring to protocols or research related code, things like that, and other materials. And these different categories, these objects have different needs. When you're talking about sharing a paper, you're having kind of a different conversation than when you're talking about sharing a data set. Similarly, you're having a kind of a different conversation when you're bringing, code and what it means to share code in a useful way into when you're having that conversation. But all of these are kind of captured under the broader umbrella of open science, and all of them are kind of fundamentally interrelated. And I'll just say here, as a person who consults with researchers all the time about planning or about sharing research objects, it's really, if you take one thing away from the talk today, it's really so much easier to share at the end or share when you want if you've planned for it ahead of time. Okay. So I'm not going to go through all these formal definitions as we right now, just to say that this slide includes some definitions for open access, data sharing, dealing with transparent methods. These are, especially the latter two, are things that have been talked about in great detail in these talks. And I don't want to rehash things that have been said expertly elsewhere, but I will say that, when you're sharing research objects, it can be more useful to discuss or consider sort of the degree of openness that you're talking about, rather than, sharing versus not sharing or open versus closed. Because as we'll see as we go kind of through stepwise through different types of sharing, it's a continuum that we're dealing with here. And one thing that I always try to emphasize when I talk about sharing and open science generally is, there's a wide variety of practices that fall under this umbrella. Okay, so why do this? Okay, but why? So this is like the most common question that's posed to me, not even professionally, just like in my life, I have a almost 5-year-old who's scrambling around downstairs somewhere, and this is his favorite question, is to ask me, okay, but why? And so why share, right? One really important reason to share research objects is so that everyone can get credit for their contributions. So those of us who work in sort of academic science or academic scholarship, primarily talk about credit in terms of citations. And there are citation principles for citing data sets, and there's even principles for sharing software. And one of the reasons to share is so that people can get credit for the work they've done. So you might have somebody who has curated a data set or worked on a piece of code or built a database or created a set of images for you or as part of this research project. And one of the reasons to share them is so other people can give them credit for that. I will say there's like, obviously, all of this is contingent upon citation being kind of the metric for credit, especially for software. It's a little unclear to me still how, this maps on directly, but, there's other ways people use software that don't get cited that still should be credit. So this is still an evolving conversation, but one of the main reasons to share is so everyone can get credit for their work, right? Another reason is share research objects so that others can check out the work that you have done. So this, as someone who creates data sets and then shares them, this is always kind of still the scariest part to me, where, I've created this data set, I've done my statistics, published a paper, and then when I put it out the data set, people can check it to make sure that the work that I'm reporting is actually correct. Actually, the scariest part for me is like when I put out code or something like a Jupyter notebook with my code in it, because I'm not always confident in the excellence of my code. Not that the conclusions are incorrect, that I don't believe in them, but just that my code isn't as expert as I'd like. But I think that it's important, right? Like it is a check on the work that we've done, that we are allowing it to be transparent and open to others to examine. This is a pretty classic demonstration. This was like trending on Twitter a couple of weeks ago of, simple things that you can do during data entry that really mess up your results. So this is, Excel automatically messing around with some dates. I know I'm misspelling February here, but I'm doing that to just kind of show how silly Excel can be. This is mostly a humorous sort of error, but this is an actually pretty substantial error where Excel will change gene names into dates. Like, so this has been reported probably for, I don't know, over a decade, maybe longer than that now, that gene name errors are widespread because of this correction. And this was noticed because people were able to go in and look at the data set and examine them. And the sort of result of this acknowledgement of error has been that these genes have been renamed, because it has turned out to be much easier to change the name of genes than to change people's behavior related to importing things into Excel. So, this is, again, kind of a humorous example, but one just to show how like simple unintentional errors can be caught as you sort of open your data and share it. So another reason, and I kind of hinted at this or said this before as I was giving our example at the beginning, one reason to share research objects is so that other researchers can make use of them. So if you create a really interesting and useful protocol for something and you make that available, then other researchers can pick that up and use it. If you create stimuli that really other people want to use, it's really helpful to just give it to them or make them available. And kind of a subset of this argument is, you really want to share research objects so that other researchers can use them to learn and build new things. Like, I can't tell you how much I've learned about writing Python scripts or even MATLAB scripts when I was using MATLAB by looking at things that other people had shared with me. And so that's one really compelling argument, I think, is, as we are creating these things, it makes sense to share them so that other people can use them. I think there's been a really, probably the most striking example of this to me in the last year and a half, right, is the sharing of the COVID genome in January 10th of 2020, right? So the new things that were built off the course of this genome were the Moderna vaccine, PCR tests, all kinds of things that have thankfully now entered our day-to-day life, were built because of a data set that was shared at the very beginning of the pandemic. So like, I can't really think of a more striking example of what kind of things can be built when you share your research objects than this, right? Another reason to share, like I've been talking mostly in terms of carrots, this one is kind of a stick, share research objects to be in line with mandates, requirements, and norms. So funders, publishers, even sort of academic institutions like Stanford have started to roll out requirements related to sharing things. NIH for the last, as long as I've been in libraries, has had a public access policy where papers arising from work that they fund must be made available through PubMed Central to the public. A kind of extension of this, or at least something that's in a similar spirit of this, is an upcoming policy where research data is going to be expected to be shared as sort of openly as possible. So this is language from the new policy that goes into effect in 2023, emphasizing the importance of good data management practices and establishing an expectation for maximizing the appropriate sharing of scientific data. So sharing a paper is a little different than sharing a data set. You know, there are certain protections of participant privacy in particular that are required when you're sharing data, that it's not really a conversation we have so much when we talk about sharing papers, but this is just an example of a mandate that is going into effect, or a policy that's going into effect. Those of you who publish may have experienced at certain open access journals and increasingly at other journals requirements to either make a statement about where your data is shared or to share your data itself. Okay. And then, you know, finally, I think an argument, it is worth having an argument or worth having a conversation to share research objects because we can and we should. You know, there's lots of kind of moral reasons for sharing research objects and it being within the spirit of scholarship and science to do so. But my view as someone who kind of entered science as we were already transitioning away from one technology to another in terms of communication, you know, this is just a continuation of that conversation. So when I was an undergrad, you know, we were tasked with looking up articles in print journals, and I've never had to do that since, right? I've never had to go in and make a photocopy of a physical article since, either as a researcher or as a librarian. You know, when this technology evolved, that is sort of scholarly publishing as we understand it now, you know, the development of scientific journals, it was a step forward in terms of openness, because prior to that, you know, scientific knowledge was primarily transferred either through sort of books or in-person meetings. This is the Royal Society, or letters between scholars who knew one another. So you had these very tight-knit, often kind of closed communities. And when scholarly journals, like the Proceedings of the Royal Society, began to be published, this in effect kind of opened that conversation. And now, you know, we have other tools for dissemination of knowledge, right? The conversation we're having now about preprints isn't even particularly new. I just throw this up here. You know, in the 60s, the NIH had a program called Information Exchange Groups, which was basically authors circulating preprints amongst themselves by sending them to an office who would photocopy them and then send them out. So, you know, the printing press was a major development in opening up lots of things, including scientific conversations. Another one was the copy machine, I guess. And still another one was the internet. So this is the Budapest Open Access Initiative kind of the statement in 2002 that kind of catalyzed, I guess, a lot of the conversation about open access, coined open access as we understand it now. And in this statement, they cite that, we have the internet. This is a method for making things available. That we can take advantage of to disseminate things widely and openly. And so this is kind of what I mean by we can and we should, right? Like we have the tools to disseminate research reports, data sets, code, all kinds of research objects. We don't need to, we can share them, so maybe we should. Okay, so I'm gonna transition now to talking about kind of conceptually what we're talking about when we're talking about sharing different types of research objects. And the most well-established kind of conversation about this is about sharing research reports. So sort of open access for publications or articles or preprints. So this is kind of how things sort of look now, or this is kind of the traditional, I guess you could call it, model of scholarly publishing, where researchers do their research, they write up something, it gets sent in to a publisher who coordinates its evaluation through peer review, and then they publish it, and then folks read it. And in the sort of historical model of this that has existed for a century or more, a couple centuries, the point at which there is an access barrier is between publishing and reading. So authors pay either nothing or comparatively little to publish their work. Readers, and in academic publishing, most often libraries, pay fees to access and read journal articles. So, researchers submit their things to whatever journal, and then those of us who work in libraries, our colleagues who handle the collection, pay for a subscription so that the folks here at Stanford or whatever academic institution we may work at can access those materials. Okay. This is in contrast to sort of open access publishing, which in some forms, readers, in all forms, readers pay nothing to access journal articles. In some forms, an author may pay an article processing charge prior to publication, or they may not, depending on how the journal or the publication is set up. So, at this point, the reader can access things unfettered, basically, no paywalls. There is a version of this also where called self-archiving, where authors submit articles for publication and deposit a version in an archive. And then the reader may pay to access the publisher copy, or they may be able to access the archived copy free of charge. So Stanford recently instituted recently passed an open access mandate or an open access policy, and it is based on this model. So when it's up and running, authors will be submitting things and self-archiving things so that others can access the self-archived copy. For those of you who kind of live and breathe in NIH world, this is what PubMed Central is. Many universities and other places have policies like this. Okay, but even with open access publishing, there's a huge range of different things. So this is kind of what I was talking about before about degrees of openness. This is a guide called How Open Is It? And just gives you, the reader, or gives you as a person trying to understand open access, ways of measuring how open things actually are in particular journals in terms of what the reader rights are, what the reuse rights are. There are some journals that allow you to read things but not republish them. There are just a huge range of policies in that. So degrees of openness here. Okay, sharing research data. I will say, the open access conversation has maybe is maybe the most established of the sort of sharing conversations that we have, but there is quite a long history of researchers talking about sharing research data as well. What is on the screen here is what I believe may be the first data availability statement in the field of psychology. So there's a series of articles beginning in the 1960s, maybe the late 50s, talking about the availability or lack thereof of research data underlying publications in that particular field. And in the mid 60s, there was a report in the American Psychologist, I believe, that was basically your first example, or at least the first example that I could find of researchers saying, oh, we asked our colleagues for their data sets and a small number of them got back to us. This paper is mostly about a kind of an attempt at replicating that to see how much change had happened and then since his publication. And they end it with this kind of cheeky statement saying that, you know, you can get the data, but you have to give us some money and tell us what jobs are available in your area, which, you know, having looked at a lot of these kinds of statements, this is a funny one, but not a not one that would be too unexpected. Maybe some of the jokes in here would be unexpected, but you still see stuff like this. Okay. And again, you know, there's different types of sharing for sharing data. The one that I think springs to mind the most immediately when we talk about research data sharing is fully open access data sharing. So data are made available through a repository that is publicly accessible. So this is your Figshares, your Dryads, your open science frameworks, that kind of thing, where you can make links that are publicly accessible. There are also, though, I should say, much more controlled forms of access where data are made available to specific people for specific purposes and or for specific time periods. I should mention also for the fully open access, you know, there's also institutional repositories. Stanford operates the Stanford Digital Repository, which I'm sure to hear more about next week, but, you know, the SDR can limit access or can control access. It's basically, I believe, sorry, library colleagues, if I get this wrong, either to the public or to Stanford sort of folks only. So there is one level of control there, but there's also much more sort of granular and nuanced degrees of control that folks put into their data sharing. You know, there's such things as data use agreements, data sharing agreements, which are kind of legal documents that say, we're sharing this data with you. You can only use it for this purpose. You know, you see this a lot in data sharing by industry where they say, we will share the data, but only after a certain period of time or a certain milestone has been reached, and after that for only a certain amount of time. There's also, you know, forms of data sharing where there's like a consortium of researchers or folks who are sharing with one another within that collaborative network. And then, you know, again, I'm not talking too much about kind of sharing objects as you're working on them today, but there's also sharing data and other resources only amongst the primary research team, right? That I guess technically is on the continuum of sharing, right? Between completely open and completely closed. More on the closed side, but not totally there, is this idea of, you know, you're sharing with your lab or your research group or something. And there's a lot of different dimensions to this as well. You know, not just the degree of who's being shared with, but also the degree of what you're allowing folks to do with the research, when you're sharing, how you're sharing. I will, again, just put on my data librarian hat and say, while you're thinking about how and through what mechanisms to share your data, some things to maybe reconsider, if possible, I'll put this as gently as possible, are sharing things upon request. This is a very, very common thing that you see people doing in data availability statements, where it says like the data and materials related to this study are available from the corresponding author upon request. or upon reasonable request, which prompts me to think about two things. First, like, what does reasonable mean in this situation? That's interesting. But also it makes me think about just like how much contact information changes in academia. So, you might have a student or a postdoc or somebody who's the corresponding author or the one with the data, and they might move on to another position, and the data might change location with them. And so as this happens, it becomes more and more difficult to access data upon request, right? You have to track down the person who has the data, who may have moved. The data may have been archived somewhere. There's a situation that I always think of like, oh, it's on a flash drive that our postdoc has, and they're in another country, and we don't have an email address for them. So that might be one reason not to make data available upon a request, is it becomes harder to track it down. As a researcher, when you make data available in this way, it also kind of makes it so that you have to have the data immediately on hand to respond to these requests. And as you're kind of moving forward in your projects, you might want to archive it somewhere or put it to the side. Something that I've actually seen a lot less of this in the last maybe 5 or so years, now that data repositories are more common. Something that I would advise against, or ask you to maybe gently reconsider, is to share data through your academic website or through a website, because there's no guarantee that that data will continue to be available over time. I heard of an example recently where a particular research community was reusing an individual researcher's data sets for a variety of things. And they were at one institution and all their stuff was on their website. But then they changed institutions and that website got taken down and that data just kind of evaporated. So maybe something to reconsider. I would also say to maybe reconsider sharing data as a supplementary material in an article, just because the links between supplementary materials and the articles they're associated with may break down, making data difficult to find and access over time. So all of this is a long way of saying, we've been talking about data and sharing things throughout many of these talks, but whenever feasible, please upload data into a data repository, which is a system that is specifically designed to organize, store, and facilitate the discovery and reuse of research data. Depending on kind of where you are in the grand landscape of science, you might have data repositories for your particular data type. Your research community might have a preference for a particular data repository. There's also generalist repositories, institutional repositories, all kinds of things. I'll put a plugin. I put a plugin at the end of this, but I will say if you are trying to figure out how to navigate anything that we're talking about today, not just sort of sharing data sets, there's probably somebody like me or my colleagues who are talking in other sessions who works in a library who can help you, point you in the right direction. Okay. I will also say that one thing about data, sharing data, that is less relevant or at least less pressing, is that when you're sharing research data, you really want to make less pressing for a research report, by which I mean, yeah, like an article or whatever. When you're sharing a data set, it's really important to make sure you're sharing it in a usable form, right? So when you're sharing like a research article, it's already formatted generally in a format that people are used to. It's written for sort of dissemination. There's reporting guidelines maybe to make some of the reporting in there better, but I think you can maybe imagine that a data set, there's a wide range of usability, right? And so we in the libraries and throughout sort of the open science conversation like to talk about this concept called data management, which is in brief, just making sure your data is actually usable. So making sure it's saved properly, organized so it can be found and used, documented so you can understand what's in there. And my reason for including it in this talk, this sort of data management stuff, is that one, if you manage your data well and you share it, there's a much greater chance that it'll actually be usable than if you don't manage it particularly well. And two, it kind of connects back to a point I made earlier, where if you plan for sharing and you plan for data management, all of this works a lot smoother. And one way that I like to talk about sort of effective management of data is like, just plan on your data being seen by others and organize it so that other people can understand what you're doing, because even that other person that we're talking about that you're sharing with might just be you in the future, who has forgotten what all these variables mean and forgotten all these things that you think are maybe obvious. Okay, so this is just a demonstration of what I mean. So this is not a real data set. I promise that I didn't actually collect data this badly, but this is an example of what a shared data set that has been poorly managed might look like. So, if I sent you this data set and said, here's the data, I think you would be hard pressed to understand what the heck I did. And you'd probably have about 1 million questions for me. The first of which being like, how dare you? How dare you send me this data set? Compared to something like this, which is a much cleaner data set in the sense that the columns at least have variable names. The variables or the data points are at least all formatted in the same way. The name of the file is at least sort of comprehensible. And we'll talk about sort of what else you would want to share in a second here. But I will then just move on to sharing research process. So data is part of the process, but part of why we write papers is to tell people what we've done. And there's actually a lot more we can share about that. We can share our protocol, so exactly the procedure or method used. We can share data dictionaries, which are sort of descriptive documents that talk about what is actually in those data sets that we're sharing. Depending on our disciplinary communities, we can share lab notebooks or other documentation. A lab notebook in some spaces in science are really the primary record of the research process and the data and the analysis and everything. I have a cousin who is a chemist, and one of our sort of fun points of comparison when I was doing neuroscience was to talk about the difference in our disciplinary communities about sort of the meaning of a lab notebook. But, exactly kind of what research you are doing may dictate which of these documents or kind of documents you are generating. I did want to just show an example of a protocol here, but I will first show, so this is our cleaned up data set that we were sharing. It's pretty unintelligible, I think, to folks who aren't doing a particular type of sort of experiment. Those of you who have some psychology background might be able to parse some of this, or maybe all of it. Again, this is not real data, but it would be much easier to have that sort of conversation about what's in these cells if you had the data dictionary, right? Which in this case is just a table that talks about what the different variables are and what they refer to. And if you were looking at my research process, it would be nice to have a example of how I got from that really messy data set to that really clean data set. And that's what this sort of documentation here is. This is not really a lab notebook, more just a log, but I think a good enough sort of illustration of kind of documentation that is useful to share if you're sharing details of your process. This is an example from a platform called protocols.io. This is not a scientific, I guess it's sort of scientific, series of steps to get from point A to point B. This in particular is the protocol I use to make coffee every morning, but you can imagine how a document like this would be super, super useful if you were collecting neuroimaging data or even behavioral data or any kind of sort of information where it's really important to follow a very precise series of steps. I will also mention that, when you're talking about research process, sometimes sharing the details of your process means sharing the code you used. This is actually a whole huge conversation that we could have about how to effectively share code and software. What I will say about it is, open source software tools are helpful when you're sharing because they grant reuse rights and change rights. And it's, really nice that people who create Python code or R code can build upon the work of others while they're doing that, and can build it within this whole ecosystem of tools to build new software tools. But if you're like an individual researcher who just wants to make their data available, I would say that it's okay to make your SPSS syntax available. That's like a step towards openness, right? You don't need to think that you need to jump headfirst into learning a new programming language, although I do really like using Jupyter notebooks and R and that kind of stuff. And I think there's huge benefits to doing that. But sharing syntax and sharing process and sharing code are valuable things, sort of no matter what you're doing. And I will also say that code should be shared in a usable form. This is particularly challenging in some environments where it becomes really important to share kind of, okay, well, we created these scripts and they need this particular software environment in which to run. So you need to have some documentation. Also, it's really helpful to have comments in your code, documentation. We could have a whole conversation about like sharing code on GitHub versus preserving it in other platforms. But I think for now, what I will just say about this is that when you're thinking about sharing your research objects, your software and your code that you've created or modified yourself are examples of those things, and they're actually really important for communicating your process. And so any steps you can take about sharing them out are good. And I've talked really, really fast, so there's going to be lots of time for questions. But I will say that as you are sharing out research objects, whether they be, research reports, whether they be slides, whether they be posters, or even cell lines or pieces of data or other materials, it's really helpful to connect the dots between all those things. So one of the reasons we started with, right, for sharing is so you can get credit or people can get credit for their work. And so an activity that should go alongside sharing is connecting the dots between your various things. And the way to do this is through persistent identifiers. A persistent identifier is basically a long-lasting reference to something. You may be aware of some or all of these. Persistent identifier for an individual is an ORCID ID. That's an example. Myself, John Borghi, I am a different person than a John Borghi who did psychology research here in the Bay Area in the 1960s, who I discovered while creating my ORCID. So this is a persistent and unique identifier for me, and I can connect my ORCID to the DOIs and the RRIDs and the various other IDs that I generate for these objects that I'm sharing. So primarily, for papers, that's DOIs. For data sets, often that's DOIs, although there are other persistent identifiers. And there's a whole class of different things. And I think next week there'll be maybe a little bit more conversation about how to do this, but I will just sort of end this part by saying that, when you share your research objects, it is really helpful to connect the dots. And the sort of best way to do that is by having persistent identifiers for things and associating them with one another. So just to wrap up, a couple of take-home points, I guess. not all sharing is open sharing. There's quite a, or open and public sharing. There's quite a continuum of practice here for all kinds of research objects. Sharing is much, much easier if you plan for it ahead of time. Different research objects have different needs. You know, sharing a paper is different than sharing data, which is different than sharing software, which is different than sharing images, which is different than sharing other things. But it can be helpful to consider sharing out your research process. So like, you know, if you're getting lost in the weeds of what are all these considerations for sharing a data set versus my code, you can maybe take a step back and think, I want to make people more aware or share out more of my process from how I got here to here. What should I do to do that? Maybe that's sharing your data, maybe that's sharing your code, maybe that's sharing your data, your code, your protocols, writing reproducible reports, all kinds of things. But I will just say that you don't have to do all of this by yourself. There are lots of people around who are available for help, you know, myself and many others within academic libraries. There's also communities like CORES. So if you have problems or like, I don't understand what this word means, what are we being asked to do here? There are certainly people for who are around to help. So that is, I think, where I'm going to end it. And again, there's a link, a DOI actually, to my slides there at the bottom. I think we have plenty of time for questions.
Awesome. Thanks very much. That was great. I just posted to the chat, I don't know if you know this data sharing and management snafu video. I'm sure you've seen it, but it's pretty humorous if anybody wants to see how data sharing can go wrong. So we have a couple questions in the chat. Joyce asked, do you have a sense for how much money NIH is expecting to support in each grant application and their new policy? Percentage of the total amount, maybe. I'm excited that NIH is mandating data sharing, but I'm worried about how much work it'll take for labs to get up to speed on data management.
So Joyce, this is like a very good question because I think everyone in this space has been asking this since they started talking about having a policy in general. My understanding is they don't have a set amount, but you can charge certain data management and sharing costs as direct costs in NIH grants, or you will be able to. I think they will be more guidance about this coming out soon. I think they're relying on some reporting from the national academies about long-term costing for this kind of stuff, but I haven't seen a fixed amount yet, or even percentage. That's a very good question that we've all been asking.
Great, thanks. Okay, so another question from the Q&A. Who guarantees the long-term storage of data in repositories? How do you think use of public free repos will change as people start collecting huge terabyte data sets?
Yeah, so it's, you know, there are some like certifications, I guess, that repositories can get in terms of like the guarantees of long-term storage, but usually it's kind of contingent upon themselves to have a plan about them. So, you know, one reason I will often recommend like an institutional repository like the Stanford Digital Repository is because as an institution, Stanford thinks in pretty long time scales and makes statements about archiving over long time scales. But most of your kind of mainstream commonly used data repositories will have a statement somewhere in either the depositing language or terms of use or something about how long they guarantee your deposit for. And it's usually 10 years or 5 years, depending on their infrastructure, with expectations of it being continued. How do I think use of public free repos will change as people start collecting huge terabyte data sets is a good question. I think one that the data repository community is grappling with right now, where I'm sort of adjacent to the community, but I will include myself in this. There's been a lot of sort of services offered for free because storage was relatively inexpensive when data sets were relatively small. But then people started depositing their sort of astronomy data or their biology, sort of big biological data sets, and they're terabytes, and suddenly the costs, like that's no longer a trivial storage cost. So I think there's starting to be a realization of trying to figure out funding models for that. And like, how can we support these massive data sets? One thing that I think is an interesting conversation to be had that I didn't include too much is, when we're talking about huge data sets, what part of that data set makes sense to share? Maybe there's like some subset of that can be archived locally at the researcher sort of level, and then publicly something that's more like a gigabytes size thing. But I think that's a very good question, and it's still kind of an open one in terms of how to deal with all of this. I think Figshare just unveiled a new service for massive data sets. And I wouldn't be surprised if other repositories sort of start rolling out features to deal with these kinds of questions.
Great, thanks. So there's a question from Greg in the chat. Great talk, John. What are your favorite data repositories?
I like to deposit data that we create in our sort of library projects in Dryad, or like an institutional repository like Stanford Digital Repository. I like both of those because I happen to know people at both of those places. So if I, have feature complaints or things, I can complain to them personally. Not that I've ever had a feature complaint for Stanford Digital Repository, but my favorite, if I'm giving sort of a broader answer to this, my favorite data repositories are the ones that are set up to handle your particular type of data. So something like, I did neuroimaging data or neuroimaging research before I was a librarian. And had I been doing that research at a different time, I would have used OpenNeuro to share data, because that's where people would go looking for it, right? Like, not to use a very relevant example for the folks on the call, but like, that's where people would expect to look for it. So that's where I would have put it. It has all the features and things for sharing that data that makes sense. So that's sort of my broader answer, is like, if there is a data set or a database or a repository that is kind of specialized for your particular data or preferred by your community, that's kind of my favorite for data sets. And these more generalist data set repositories are great and do their job really, really well. But, people might not think to immediately log into Dryad to go look for a data set by me or something like that.
Yeah, no, I completely agree with that. So we have a few minutes left. I wanted to, you said something in passing about GitHub, and obviously, tons of people share code on GitHub. And I want to hear your thoughts on that versus, what the alternatives might be.
Sure. So I will say that, like, okay, first I'll start with an anecdote. I did a survey as a postdoc where we were talking about just like trying to understand some things around research related software and code. And we asked a question there, like, to you, the researcher, what is the difference between saving and preserving? And one of the responses we got that I thought was very telling and actually very informative was, saving is putting my code on GitHub, and preserving is leaving my code on GitHub. and so GitHub is a really good tool. Like, lots and lots of people use it to either share your code with collaborators or kind of more broadly, but it isn't actually a repository, right? It's a version control system. It's, a bunch of different things, but they don't actually have a preservation strategy like you'd want a data repository, like a repository, to have. I mean, I guess they have like some, there's some GitHub repos that are like inscribed on something and put in the Arctic for preservation. There's like a whole initiative there, but in terms of like actionable data preservation or preservation, that's not what they're there for. They're there for sort of sharing of active things amongst collaborators or sharing of things relatively short term. That being said, my perspective on this is always to kind of meet folks where they are. So in terms of sharing code, my advice is like, share your code on GitHub because that's great. People will find it there. One of the reasons I don't like that for long-term preservation is like, you could change the contents of your repository. And then if you have a link to a repository from a paper, people might go through it and then find not what they're looking for at all. One nice sort of elegant solution though is to upload code to GitHub, do whatever you're doing on GitHub, and then set up a Zenodo integration where it gets, anytime you do a release on GitHub, it just gets preserved through their infrastructure. So Zenodo is it's like a data repository, but really a research object repository. They will take all kinds of things, including slides for this very talk. And it's operated by CERN. And one of the things that CERN is really keen on is like sharing, particle physics data on its own is not particularly useful. What is more useful is to share the workflow alongside of it. So they've built quite a nice system for sort of preserving code and other things. It has, and they have a preservation backend that you would want for something like this. So you can upload your data to GitHub, do whatever work you want to do on GitHub, do a release, it goes to Zenodo, it gets the DOI that people can cite. And when they go to that DOI, it's like a archived version of your repo that is preserved in CERN's digital infrastructure, which is, as you would expect, quite robust.
Yeah, I think that's definitely the workflow that we have started using. The one thing to say is like, if I agree with your point about meeting people where they are, and a lot, sometimes people don't have the bandwidth necessarily to do this full solution. One sort of interim solution would be to, at least if you're going to put like a GitHub link in a paper, say which commit ID for that particular analysis, because so otherwise somebody will come along and see, oh, there have been changes made since the paper, what version of the code went into the paper. Yeah, exactly. But I agree, I think that the Zenodo approach is definitely the optimal one. So we should probably end now. And so we want to thank you again, John. This is really great. And we'll be back next week with Zach Painter, who's going to kind of flesh out some of this in terms of how to do it practically. So thanks again.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone.